Welcome everyone. As you join us from the waiting room, we're just going to take a moment here as we wait for others to join and allow you to get settled into your seats there, get it settled into this virtual space. So we'll start in just a moment or two. All right, we're seeing our numbers climbing higher here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really thrilled to be launching this first conversation in our Beyond the Headline series. I'm joining you today from unceded and traditional homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we work across British Columbia. My office works across British Columbia on many people's unceded and traditional lands. And I want to start us off with both that gratitude that I think many of us feel and should feel towards those who have stewarded these lands for so many generations, but also couple that with the sense of responsibility that comes with for those of us who are settlers and migrants on this land to take responsibility for decolonizing insofar as we can work toward decolonization in our own spaces, in this space here as we have this conversation, and in terms of the work that we're all doing. I know that many of you are working on housing issues and thinking about housing issues, and that's what joins you here today. And Indigenous rights and decolonization work is particularly important in that space. As I mentioned, I'm just thrilled to bring you together today for this first conversation in what will be a series of conversations hosted by BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I'm Kasari Govender. I'm BC's Human Rights Commissioner. But of course, I do not do this work alone. And even just behind the scenes on this very call, we have many members of our team. So big shout out and thank you to all of those who are making this happen, who you can't actually see, some of whom will be on the chat there with us. And I'll talk a bit more about that. In August of this year, we released our first Rights in Focus report, which aims to really survey the landscape of human rights in the province. And our goals we had many goals in this work, some of which was to be able to build our common understanding of what human rights issues are unfolding in our communities and around us, around the province. Both for public education and awareness, and also to be able to leverage change. So to help our decision makers also understand that context and help advocates by having this sort of information to rely on. In that report, we highlighted 10 key systems that we saw as being really important to how we all interact with human rights and how human rights abuses manifest in our world. And this series will look at one of those issues in each of our series. And of course, today is housing. The other systems we looked at were the child protection system, healthcare system, criminal justice system, and so on. But before I get any deeper into what it is that we are going to talk about today, I want to welcome my guest here today, Marie-Josée Houle. Thank you so much for joining us, the federal housing advocate. Before I pass it over to you, I want to spend a moment telling everybody more about your background and your many impressive accomplishments that you bring with you today. Marie-Josée was appointed as Canada's first federal housing advocate in February of 2022, marking a new chapter in her career in housing and homelessness. Prior to her appointment, she consulted and led a number of roles, including frontline work, project management for affordable housing development, bylaw review, housing-related research projects, developing educational programs for housing profits, nonprofits, and co-ops. Sorry, not housing profits. That would be the wrong word I was looking for there. She has worked with diverse partners in the sector to foster innovation, leverage strategic partnerships, and address gaps and human rights violations related to housing. She is widely recognized for her leadership in this sector, her community activism, her human rights expertise. And certainly when we've worked together on encampment issues, and I've had the privilege of crossing paths with her and her strong team on working through homelessness and encampment issues in British Columbia. And I've been constantly impressed by her deep thinking on these issues and her passion and empathy for protecting the human dignity of those most impacted by the housing crisis. So I want to pass it to you, Marie-Josée, for you to say hello and acknowledge the territories that you're on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Oh my gosh. Whenever I hear, my bio, I'm like, who is this person? But thank you. I'm so humbled. And thanks for your kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's a real privilege to be among you all. And I do want to begin by acknowledging the privilege of joining you from this for this discussion from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And not too long ago, I was kind of reminded that the term unceded is a very polite word for stolen. And I think about that a lot in my work in housing and homelessness. I'm also honored, you know, uh, well, I'd like to honor the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from coast to coast to coast. My role as federal housing advocate is to be an independent and nonpartisan monitoring mechanism for the right to adequate housing in Canada. And my mandate is detailed in the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act. And I was appointed for a 3-year term starting in February of 22. And for anyone who's interested, you can find more information about my role and see our reports on our website. And as I'm saying this, one of my colleagues is also working very hard in the background, and he's going to be posting a link in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. The topics we're going to cover today are kind of a range of issues related to housing and homelessness. We're going to talk about the rights of encampment residents, the obligations of local governments and provincial and federal governments at the same time, the role of upstream and downstream approaches to housing and homelessness, from income supports to tents, gender-based violence, and how those issues have kind of a complex relationship to both the lack of housing and housing crisis, but also how we address the housing crisis and public policy responses. The intersectional impacts of the housing crisis, for example, on Indigenous people, and more. When I was searching for a way to kind of ground this conversation as a bit of a jumping off point, I was reminded of the words of Brian Stevenson, who's a prison activist, criminal justice lawyer in the southern U.S., working on behalf of those who are mostly those who are wrongfully accused. And his famous words that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And that felt like a lovely starting point, perhaps, for our conversation today. Before we delve into the questions themselves, just a few housekeeping points. The discussion will be shaped by questions from folks with lived experience and with living experience, as well as community advocates working in the housing sector. Excuse me. And there will be some time for questions and answers at the end, once we've gone through some of those questions that we received ahead of time. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's that Q&A function in Zoom for webinar. Please post your questions there. The chat itself will not be a forum for folks to post to each other. So the chat is limited to talking to us on the panel or to our team working behind the scenes. So please use that Q&A function for your questions themselves. We have ASL interpretation or translation here with us today. Thank you so much for John, who's joining us as well, who you can see on your screen. We've pinned him so that he is visible to all of you. We also have closed captioning available, so you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to get access to closed captioning. I mentioned at the beginning that some of our team is here in the background. Megan and Chitha, who you've already seen posting in the chat, will be continuing to post some relevant links and responding to any tech issues. So if you have anything that is going wrong for you, please feel free to reach out to them. All right, so with all those introductory pieces out of the way, I want to turn to our first kind of substantive question here. Marie-Josée, let's start with the $1 million question here. In your perspective, what does it mean to have a right to housing?
It is the multi-million-dollar question. What it really boils down to is that all governments in Canada have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to adequate housing for everyone living in Canada. It doesn't mean that governments have to provide a home to everyone, but the right to adequate housing means that all people are equally entitled to live in dignity and in a safe and secure home, and that everyone should be able to access housing that meets their needs without discrimination or harassment. We know that housing's more than just four walls and a roof. Adequate housing provides protection from forced evictions. It's affordable, it's habitable with enough room for the inhabitants. It provides basic services like clean water and sanitation. It must be accessible for people with all abilities and in a location that provides access to basic services. And it also has to be culturally appropriate. So all these 7 elements of adequacy, they're critical to fulfilling the right to adequate housing. And Canada ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1976. And this ratification created binding obligations on all levels of government to uphold and take steps to fulfill the right to adequate housing. So the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019, which came 43 years after the Covenant, it's important, and it's important because for the first time, housing was recognized as a fundamental right in Canadian legislation. And the legislation also reaffirmed Canada's commitment to the progressive realization to the right to housing, to adequate housing. So when you think about it, housing is probably the most fundamental of all human rights. Having a safe, dignified place to call home is one of the most basic of human needs, and the right to housing is connected to so many other human rights, and the right to education, to physical and mental health, to political participation, and even the right to life. So I want to highlight another crucial piece here. The right to adequate housing must be applied in conjunction with the rights articulated in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This includes support for Indigenous governments to provide self-determined culturally appropriate housing and supports to their citizens regardless of their place of residency. And all levels of government must recognize that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis jurisdiction and accelerate transfer of care and control of housing and homelessness programs, and programs in other areas such as mental health and addictions as requested by these governments, and respecting existing funding arrangements with Indigenous governments and their representative organizations. So we won't have achieved reconciliation in Canada until we ensure that all Indigenous people have adequate and culturally appropriate housing. And this can't be stressed enough. When we talk about a housing crisis in Canada, it's also an Indigenous crisis.
Thank you for that. And there's so much in there of what you said, and I just wanted to pull out that concept of progressive realization for those who might not be really familiar with that term. sort of in short form, it means that we have to continue the work to realize. It doesn't mean that it's instantaneous full realization of a right or full fulfillment of a right, but that there is an ongoing obligation to take steps to the best of our financial ability and our capacity to take those steps. And I wonder, you've given us a really good kind of big picture of what the right to housing is. Can you give us any examples of what you think the next steps are to progressively realizing this, right?
Wow. Well, having been in this job for almost 3 years, some things are really clear. We need legislation at the provincial and municipal levels to recognize the right to adequate housing, and that creates adequately funded accountability mechanisms, something similar to my office. It would be really nice. It's a huge country. And it would be really nice to have counterparts at the provincial, territorial, and municipal levels to take recommendations that I make that are aimed at a national level to make them make sense to help guide governments at their levels. And and to nuance them to their particular needs as well, and then dive into their own systemic issues that are very particular to them. But even without these new laws, like, we can work with the language of the Charter and the National Housing Strategy Act to make significant, pardon me, I'm gonna sneeze, I think.
Right.
Um, Sorry, we can work with the language of the Charter and the National Housing Strategy Act to make significant progress protecting everyone's right to adequate housing, but we do need federal leadership.
Mm,
And what I mean by that, they need to be leading by example, even by using human rights language when they talk about housing.
yeah.
And I also mean changing government litigation strategies to ensure government lawyers cease arguing that the right to adequate housing is non-judiciable, and that housing is not intrinsically linked to the right to life and equality. We need more education for judges and lawyers to better understand human rights and their interconnectedness with other rights, particularly Section 7 of the Charter of Right to Life and Section 15 on equality rights. So with this in mind, my office recently released a report entitled Encampments and Legal Obligations, Evolving Rights and Relationships. And this report draws attention to and deepens understanding of the human rights and legal obligations that must inform government responses to homelessness and encampments. And a link to that is going to be put in the chat.
Yeah.
We also need significant new investments in supportive services and a national evidence-based strategy to support people with mental health and substance use issues. We need more public education to counteract NIMBYism and focus attention on the systemic failures. We need to stop blaming individuals and thinking that the problem will go away if people just disappear or if they move out of your neighborhood. And we need more funding for legal aid and more brave souls to bring cases that will develop new jurisprudence that incorporates key principles of international human rights law.
It's a great segue to the next topic, which was really about encampments. And I'll just take a moment to speak about BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner and our the work that we've done in this space around encampments, and particularly providing guidance to local governments about how to take this kind of rights-based approach to encampment response. We've put out guidance for local governments, and I think I'm sure that link will also be dropped into the chat. We've put out guidance around that the right to housing in international law includes protections against forced eviction, which you've already touched on. The removal of encampments without meaningful engagement with encampment residents themselves, to find adequate forms of housing for them if they're going to leave the encampment, that they have somewhere, not just another park to go to where they need to take down their tents in the morning, but actually somewhere that can be a home to them. And also that there's these international law protections, but also that these have manifested in domestic law protections as well, that courts in BC have held that there are constitutionally protected rights to shelter in public parks, exactly the connection that you've just been drawing out around the connection between the right to life and the right to housing and how that plays out in the encampment context. And that so far, at least, the right to shelter in public parks has been found during nighttime hours. More of an open question, perhaps around daytime hours. And this is only when there are insufficient accessible shelter spaces publicly available, that those spaces, even if those are available, that they need to be actually appropriate to the needs of encampment residents. We've also talked in this guidance about how not, forced eviction can be justified in limited circumstance. It's not an absolute right. That, for example, on the balance of human rights considerations, displacing people, they could be maybe displaced from hazardous areas where there's a threat to their own lives at stake, but that deteriorating health and safety conditions within an encampment should not be used to justify forced eviction when it's public policies or public approaches that have allowed those unsafe conditions to happen in the first place. And that's a really, really key point I wanted to make. I know something that you and I have talked about in the past and that we have a lot of common ground on is around, along with everything else, is that a shelter bed is not adequate housing. If an individual refuses to accept a particular option, for example, due to a lack of security or autonomy or privacy or safety in that setting, the governments need to provide another form of acceptable housing. I wonder, with that kind of outline of from our perspective, what the local government obligation is, if you can talk any more about that, what local government should be able to expect or should be expecting from federal and provincial governments to enable them to meet those obligations.
Wow. Oh, there's so much I want to say about all of this. Well, first of all levels of government, including local government, are responsible for upholding human rights obligations. So my report documented the systemic nature of human rights violations associated with encampments, and they called for urgent action from all governments. And when we talk about encampments responses, the focus should always be on finding permanent and adequate housing with the supports that people may need. However, we all know the current reality is that the housing and supports are just not available for everyone. So in this situation, governments have an obligation to ensure people living in encampments have access to the necessities to live safely and in dignity. So in my recommendations, I called on the municipalities to immediately provide, with the provincial and federal support, access to potable water, sanitation facilities, heating and cooling, garbage pickup, like all of these things that we all expect if we're fortunate enough to be housed. So people's lives are at stake, and we're facing another winter. Some provinces were already in the throes of winter, and we can't afford to be wasting time and energy fighting over jurisdiction. And so there's no question that local governments, they are on the front lines and often lack the powers and resources to respond adequately, and they need coordinated support from both the federal and provincial governments. I heard, from many that even when the resources are available, they aren't easily accessible or they aren't offered from departments that are not the usual suspects at different levels of government. And that creates an incredible burden to the municipalities and to the people that work there. So, and municipalities also need to develop their own capacity, particularly around applying a human rights-based approach to in key areas like, for example, meaningful engagement. Meaningful engagement with people with lived experience is really looking at an untapped resource. It's not about people should, they must, and they're in trouble because they're not like me. That is a systemic failure. And this is also why we're finding ourselves in this crisis. So, we need meaningful engagement with people with lived experience, and it can't be a box ticking exercise either, and the engagement needs to happen at all stages of development while identifying the barriers and then identifying strategies to overcome these barriers. We need to work with Indigenous leaders, and municipalities also need to develop capacity to, really just change their own mindset and get away from this this paternalism or that we know best. And in the end, the human rights-based approach really is about creating trust. And that takes time because without trust, you won't get buy-in and you won't get the desired result. People need to see themselves in the options that are being offered to them. And one example that comes to mind around that is for so long, certain people have been told you will never get housing or social housing because you are on some sort of list that states that you were evicted because you have arrears. So you'll never ever get social housing ever again. And then if we're saying, well, hey, work with us and we'll get you into social housing, well, they've always been told they will never get it again. So then how do you build that trust? Because people don't see themselves that, or they don't see that solution applying to them. And, and then, so we need to work on that and we need to have a conversation that's deeper than just throwing out options um, that people have been, well, refused in the past. And then of course, municipalities, they need to support the implementation of my recommendations. I published a fact sheet that includes all the recommendations aimed at municipal governments, and they're available through the Homeless Hub. And again, another link will be put in the chat. And most of all, local governments they need leadership and a commitment to human rights. So we're seeing significant pushback, which is terrifying for me, from some segments of society who argue without proof that evictions and forced treatments are the solutions. And we need political leaders at all levels of government who recognize that the current crisis emerged over decades because of a series of systemic failures. And we need our political leaders, particularly at the municipal level, to say there's another way. And we're not going to score cheap political points by victimizing people whose society's already tried to marginalize.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a growing problem, I think, that many of us see in our local and provincial politics and federal. Um, I wonder if we want to turn to a question that we got from a community organizer, from Marcel Germer, who is the social development coordinator for the city of Cranbrook, who works with both the city and folks on the ground in finding rights-based solutions that benefit all the citizens of Cranbrook, where he's working. And Marcel's question is, do you consider tents to be housing and for the resident to have all the same rights as a housed person? If yes, how can or should policies be changed in BC to reflect this? For example, are encampments an answer to the housing crisis? What's the interaction between social assistance and housing, income levels and income supports? And sort of there's a lot packed in potentially to this question.
Well, first let's go back to the definition of adequate housing. And tents are not adequate housing, and encampments, they're not a solution to our housing and homelessness crisis. But in the conversations I've had with people living in encampments, living in a tent or a temporary shelter, that was the best of a series of bad options that were available to them. And our human rights, they're not determined by your housing status. Everyone has the same human rights, including the right to adequate housing, and everyone has the same right to health care. And everyone has a right to privacy and to be protected from arbitrary search and seizure. And everyone deserves equal protection before the law.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely agree with you. And we've outlined the same kind of considerations in some of our work. And it's that piece around this is no one's encampments are no one's idea of the solution to the housing crisis, but that doesn't mean that we can just get rid of them. In fact, there are still people's homes, as you say. They are kind of the best of a series of bad options for many people, and we need to start with respect for that before we can move to some of the or start for that individual with where they're at, and respecting those rights. I wanted to address for a moment this question about what other provincial policies might need to adjust if we do understand that people have those same rights, whether they're living in tents or in an enclosed stable home. And I was thinking about bylaw changes to allow people to keep their belongings with them during the day. We know that one of the big issues facing folks is that they're told, unless they're in an encampment that is being protected in some way, that they're told that they can only stay in parks overnight, and after that, they're out, and during the day. And I'm going to ask you a little bit later about the issue of belonging, so I'll hold on to that for a moment. But I know, certainly when I've met with some municipalities who are forcibly evicting encampment residents, when I've asked where are people supposed to go, the answer is they can stay in another park. They just have to take down their stuff. But of course, they're getting tickets for bylaw infractions if they're not following those rules. The provision of safe heating and cooling, as you said, and cooking facilities and sanitation facilities is another one that we need to change kind of our framing around. Yes, this may not be the ideal solution, but it is the reality that this is people's best choice, and so we need to respect their rights in that context. Building on this question from Marcel, our next community question comes from Polly Sutherland, who is the team lead and harm reduction coordinator for the Moving Mountains Community Action Team, and the organization Anchors in the East Kootenay, which are both organizations and initiatives who supported folks impacted by poverty and homelessness, among the many other things on their plate. Polly spoke about the challenges, discrimination, stigma, and support for the growing unhoused population in her community, and the challenge that faces her organizations and other community organizations in these roles, especially during the toxic drug crisis and some of the capacity constraints on them. Her question was, what plans are in the works when it comes to supporting and developing encampments and the community agencies that are offering this very critical government support in these spaces, very critical support in these spaces? And why are encampments being destroyed, and why is the government putting on blinders when it comes to the value encampments are offering our citizens?
Mhm. Well, there's so many things that worry me about the conjecture of the toxic drug crisis and the homelessness crisis. In particular, I'm concerned that many governments are now painting pictures of people in encampments, that they're all plagued with addiction and mental health issues, and that they're incapable of making any good decisions, to the point that they must be forced into treatment. If we're going to be completely honest, as a society, if everyone's struggling with mental health and addictions ended up in encampments, as my good friend Sam Watts from Montreal said to the media recently, many people living in affluent neighborhoods would also be living in encampments. So we need to stop the stigma. This has to stop. So forcing people into institutions, however, and administering treatment without their consent risks violating people's fundamental human rights. And we need to fight for a human rights-based approach. The voices of lived experience is not only valuable, but imperative to decision-making. And the issue is meant to, framing the issue in this way that we're seeing in some of the province, it's meant to continue to silence people and to further entrench really a paternalistic approach that the state knows what's best for people, and that this is individual failure of people, and they're failing because they're not exactly like us. And some governments are looking for quick fixes. And well, there are no quick fixes right now, especially when it comes to the very complex issues around homelessness and mental health and substance use issues. So we need a coordinated approach that involves all government and all departments in each government. And my report on encampments called for a national encampments response plan led by the federal government, but bringing provinces and territories and municipalities to the table to work together to implement a human rights-based approach. And I also called for all governments to prohibit forced evictions, which, again, we know don't work, but They do cause more harm. So following the report, the federal government announced new funding specifically targeted at supporting communities that support human rights-based action plans as part of their encampments response. And I understand that the federal government is currently negotiating with the provinces, including BC, to match those funds. So while I welcome this initiative as an important step, I do have a number of concerns, publicly. So, organizations, so sorry, organizers could share the link on the October 3rd statement in the chat. And moving on from that, I do want to state that it's essential that there are clear guidelines on what constitutes a human rights-based approach to encampments. It worries me that the language of human rights is being co-opted and twisted. So we need clarity on that. And, for today's purposes, I'm going to throw a few things out there. That it needs to include immediate measures to protect the life, dignity, and human rights of people who are unhoused and living in encampments, including essential services such as clean drinking water, electricity, healthcare, and harm reduction, heating and cooling, sanitation, cooking facilities, and waste collection. We need a commitment to repealing bylaws which constitute to the criminalization and insecurity of encampment residents. We need meaningful engagement of encampment residents in the design, implementation, decision-making, and evaluation of human rights-based community action plans. And we need meaningful engagement of Indigenous governments and organizations in the action plans in line with the obligations under UNDRIP. And so, I also continue to advocate for a coordinated and all-of-government approach that's needed to address this crisis, as well as, frankly, the root causes of homelessness. We need to look upstream, and this encampments response funding should be offered alongside other federal housing funds so that communities can provide long-term solutions. We're not looking for Band-Aids.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I have heard you talk so eloquently in the past in our many conversations on this about the value of stuff to human dignity, and I think it's something that we don't all think about that much. And those of us who have a lot of stuff might think of stuff more in a consumer way and a kind of maybe through more of a capitalist lens. But I've really heard you talk about that connection between belongings and human dignity, and I wonder if you can talk for a moment about that connection and why that's important to encampment response, or how that factors into encampment response.
Well, we all need items to survive, and we all need items that make us feel human. And, it's one thing, we're really good at judging other people's stuff.
Yep.
And if we were going to be, honest, we can walk into someone's basement or their attic and go, why do you have all this stuff? It's garbage. And we can treat it in the same way that we treat the stuff that people have in encampments that people complain about, that it's an eyesore, that it's a public health issue. It'll attract rats and bed bugs and all kinds of other things. But, if we're going to be very honest, we can look at our own homes and say, how much of our stuff falls into those categories in the eyes of a stranger who doesn't understand the value that we give it. And it's very interesting to me how people who have homes are allowed to have stuff and how the people experiencing homelessness are not. Whether it's, when people, approach the doors of a homeless shelter and they're told, well, they can only have a certain amount of stuff that's kept, if any at all, or that when people are tolerated to spend the night in a in a park, but by 8 o'clock in the morning they need to pack up and be gone, and they need to carry all their items of survival and all the items that make them human on their body. And just the mere act of doing this means they're burdened. and that they're identifiable um, as people experiencing homelessness or housing precarity, and therefore they're immediately stigmatized and they're not allowed to use the bathroom. Um, so then they can't live with dignity. They can't even go to the bathroom, be able to wash their hands. They're not welcome anywhere. So, this to tie this back to encampments, while encampments can't be an end game, they can be a place that can help stabilize a person's situation and be a step in their readiness to transition to adequate housing. And it is a place where people can put down their stuff and lay it out the way that they feel is comfortable and to claim a bit of space for themselves. It can be a source of community, and it can provide a space where people can have privacy and store their personal belongings and not have to carry the weight of it everywhere they go. Evictions, they cause harm at so many levels, including the loss of personal items, as well as the carefully curated items for survival. And I recently met with residents from Crab Park who shared examples of park rangers confiscating baby clothes from a tent, in the park while their mother was receiving medical treatment. And I also regularly heard stories about tents being slashed during so-called cleanup operations. And these examples and many more demonstrate the total lack of regard for the dignity and rights and humanity of people who are unhoused. And these actions, we would never do that to people who are housed. We would never go into a stranger's home and say, this is garbage. This isn't good. What are you doing with that? And then just get rid of it for them or destroy them. So there's no question that these actions really undermine trust, and they make it harder for people who are so vulnerable, to help them believe in a future and believe in a system that's actually there to help them and believe that they will be able to one day have permanent housing solutions. And then if that trust is gone, they're going to become entrenched. And that's incredibly dangerous.
I have two more questions that I'm hoping to fit in terms of from our community members that sent us questions ahead of time. But I do want to wrap up with enough time for questions. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll read them both together, and then you can kind of pick and choose where you think where the best answers lie. The first one is from Aboriginal Housing Management Association, specifically Indigenous Youth Housing Strategy Steering Committee. This committee is made up of Indigenous leaders, and these two groups are working together to create youth-centered housing models and an Indigenous youth engagement framework so that government and sector leaders can learn how to best engage with Indigenous youth in housing responses in BC. So their question is, considering the risk of sexual exploitation of young people in encampments or facing homelessness, what protocols would you suggest should be implemented to prevent sexual exploitation? So that first question is really focused on preventing and addressing sexual exploitation for those facing homelessness. The second question was submitted by the Kelowna Lived Experience Circle on Homelessness. Folks in this circle serve as kind of a liaison between the decision makers and people living in encampment communities or who are unhoused. And they've shared with our office the successes that they've had with this approach of prioritizing lived experience in both decision making and relationship building with encampment residents. So their question is, they've said, we are deeply concerned in our community with the increase in homelessness that they're seeing for older adults, particularly older women, with notable rises in elderly folks having to live in their cars or being forced into care environments that are not appropriate for their needs, particularly Indigenous elders. What could governments, health authorities, care providers, etc., be doing better to protect older adults, particularly urban Indigenous elders, from the risk of homelessness to begin with? So I think both questions really highlight kind of this intersectional approach to understanding the housing crisis. We're looking at young people, we're looking at old people, we're looking at seniors, we're looking at Indigenous folks, we're looking at women and youth and gender diverse people who might be particularly subjected to sexual violence. What kind of public policy responses do we need to truly address that kind of intersectional experience and the reality of houselessness and encampments in particular?
Wow. Well, yeah, I appreciate very much these questions, and um, I think it really rightly puts the emphasis on protecting people who choose to live in encampments. So as I said earlier, encampments, they're not safe, right? And nor are they alternatives available for people young and old. To relate to the first question, sexual predators and organized crime, they target people who are vulnerable wherever they may be. So violence, including gender-based violence, is an issue that's disproportionately impacts all people experiencing homelessness, including people using shelters. And it's not necessarily a greater risk for those living in encampments. We know that youth, women, and gender diverse folks choose to live in encampments or sleep in their cars or couch surf or return to an abusive home because they feel even less safe in shelters. And I'm concerned that reports of sexual violence, they're often used to justify forced evictions. And Kasari, you wrote a really awesome op-ed about that. That some municipalities have used the issue of sexual violence to just raise an encampment. And yet, if the sexual violence had happened in the lobby of an apartment building, we wouldn't be evicting everyone in the apartment building. Right. So how does this approach to people living in encampments make sense? And how does this make people more safe? We and this is, really terrifying for me to see that, authorities co-opt again the human rights language to justify actions which really undermine efforts to protect the human rights. So, during my review with many encampments residents, they expressed a greater fear about being alone on the street or in certain temporary housing situations, such as shelters and um, single room occupancy units. So many expressed that they see encampments, as a place for the first time in their lives that provides community and support and safety for most of the people living there. That's not the case for all encampments, but some of them, this is a reality for them. And the problem with sexual exploitation encampments, it needs to be tackled at several levels. They need to empower residents to be part of the solution. So municipalities should be meeting regularly with encampment residents so that the residents can identify their own safety needs and the best way to address them. Some have asked for security. Some absolutely distrust security, depending on what form it's been offered. And in my report, I recommend that municipalities should recognize and engage with maybe informal peer leadership in the encampment and support the emergence of, camp-led consensus-based decision making. And where there's evidence of sexual exploitation and violence, the police interventions they have to be trauma informed, and they need to be culturally sensitive and focus on finding the perpetrators and not criminalizing all residents of the encampment. And, they need to stay focused on addressing, again, the root causes of homelessness and providing solutions that involve permanent housing with social supports for those that need them. With regards to gender-based violence, it is really at an epidemic level, and we need to prioritize expanding safe housing and providing economic supports, recognize invisible homelessness, and support wraparound services. With regards to the second question, again, it speaks really to stop operating in silos. Um, Homelessness in this country is a legacy of colonialism. It's become a crisis for Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. And we can't address the housing and homelessness crisis without implementing UNDRIP the calls to action for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the calls for justice of the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So as I mentioned, in my opening statement, a housing crisis is an Indigenous crisis. And there's so much I want to say about this, but I think, yeah, maybe I'll save that for another time.
Thank you. I know there's so many ways we could take this conversation and so many threads to pick up on that I'm
Mhm.
also restraining myself. Um, I think that one of the pieces that again ties both these questions together for me is around. I'll give you an example. There was a municipality in BC that was forcibly decamping folks, and one of the primary reasons being offered was violence experienced in a camp by women and gender diverse people, and yet when I asked what was happening as a response, it was there were no housing options given, particularly for women in those situations that were leaving violent situations. They were not being housed necessarily. They were being told to leave, just like every other encampment resident. There were no anti-violence services being offered to them in the context of them supposedly their needs being addressed by this decampment effort, and there were no culturally appropriate supports being offered. And we know, of course, that Indigenous women and girls often need culturally appropriate anti-violence services to address their needs. So it really undermined the justification that was being offered, that this was about protecting women and girls and gender diverse people, in my mind, if we're not willing to offer those kinds of services in response. I do want to turn to some of the questions from the audience and really appreciate the level of engagement that we're seeing here from folks. I wanted to speak. One of these questions speaks to particularly the experience of folks with intellectual disabilities. And the question is, what concrete actions are being taken or need to be taken at the federal and provincial levels to ensure that people with intellectual disabilities have the right to choose and live in independent, community-based housing, free from institutionalization and with access to person-centered supports that empower them to fully participate in the social and economic life of their communities?
Wow, yeah, it's a big question. And that really falls under, the I think the paternalism of governments and some of these actions that I'm seeing, or at least some of the narratives, about how people don't have the ability to to know what's best for them, and they can't possibly be the experts of their own lives. And a
Yeah.
human rights-based approach really, it highlights that they are, and again, the untapped resource. So uh not everyone is necessarily able to express the or pinpoint the systemic issue that harms them, but they are able to express the harm that they're experiencing. And this is where we really need to listen, like truly, truly listen and stop making assumptions about people. And we also need to make sure that we have systems to support people with all kinds of disabilities. And we need, disability benefits that will truly help people access homes that are adequate and that meet their needs. And this is a big issue of contention right now with the federal government, is that, we've demonstrated the need, and by we, I mean civil society, and yet what they're willing to dish out is just not quite cutting it. Not in terms of affordability for one, but even access and what truly will help pay for the different kinds of supports that different different people need. And we need to be honest about that as well. It's not going to be free, but then neither is homelessness.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to pull out one thread of what you're talking about there is you're talking about tailoring responses to particular needs. I think, to put even a finer point on that, is to tailor supportive housing to particular needs and provide supports within housing that will set people up for success, set people up for long-term stability in their housing, and not rob them of their autonomy in order to have not have that have to be a trade-off of trading support appropriate supports for their autonomy.
Yeah, and when it comes to support programs, the ones that I've seen when I was working on the ground were always time limited, time bound. And it's
Okay.
almost to say, we're going to invest in you, but only once and only for a limited time. And during that time, you need to get yourself, on your feet, and we're going to teach you how to, open a bank account and do some banking and pay your rent on time and maintain a home and deal with, the struggles with mental health and addiction, and then you're going to get a job, and then you're going to be great. And all of this is going to happen within 1 year. And, maybe 1 year is enough for some people, and some people it's a light touch. But for
Mhm.
some people, they're going to need supports for the rest of their life, and we're going to need to be okay with that. And for some people, they're going to cycle in and out. And when they do need the supports, it needs to be there so that they don't lose everything, including their home and their dignity, and then have to wait years before getting help again.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In our last couple of minutes before we wrap up, I know there are many questions and we're not getting enough time to address all of them. But I wondered, one person asked, talking about the importance of centering lived and living experience, and asked, what does meaningful engagement really look like? And have you seen an example of this done well?
Mm. I saw it done fairly well when I was invited to a session with the mayor of Longueuil in Quebec and community partners, as well as people with lived experience, and even city councilors that were present and municipal employees around the issue of encampments. And it was framed right away by Caroline Leblanc, who is a human rights expert and an encampments expert. She's been doing amazing, amazing work in that field. And, so it really set the tone. So everyone understood why they were there, and what the framing was going to be. And, I think when engaging, when doing meaningful engagement, it's not just, cornering someone on the street, or, and saying, okay, well, I need you to tell me about this. It's meaningfully preparing people and for understanding why they're there, and what they can expect. And then, why what they're going to share is so critical and important. And to have people there who can also answer their questions, because it's one thing to be drawing from the well all the time and then have giving nothing back in return, or just or that coming up with solutions where people don't recognize their contributions in. So that's why it's really important to meaningfully engage people with at all stages, from identification to implementation of solutions. But it can't just be a box ticking exercise.
Agreed. And I'm going to get, please correct me if you know this example and I'm using the wrong city, but one of the examples I think of is what happened in Vancouver, and I'm located in Vancouver, was that there was an order from the fire chief, and that's what led to a large decampment or forcible eviction of folks on along Hastings a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago. And I remember hearing in the follow up to that there was an example of, I believe it was Saskatoon, but I can't swear to which city it was. It was where there was a fire order and a fire chief who worked really collaboratively with folks living in homelessness in the encampment, and was able to come up with solutions that didn't forcibly decamp people. And I thought it was really interesting to be able to see, real safety concerns. Of course, we don't want our safety requirements not to apply in encampments. State has just as much obligation to keep people safe as they do elsewhere. But it's about what the solutions are to that, and there may actually be kind of community-based solutions to that, as opposed to moving forward with only one vision of what it means to be safe in an encampment.
Right. And it means addressing, again, the root cause, but it comes from framing, right? And refusing, this is Saskatoon, by the way, refusing to be weaponized against people who are suffering already so much.
Yeah,
And that really was the framework. That's where they came from and how they decided that their response was going to be, we're going to treat people in encampments and experiencing homelessness in the same way that we would treat anyone who has just been rendered homeless because they just experienced a fire in their home.
yeah,
They're one and the same.
yeah,
So then, they wanted to, first of all, build a relationship and connect people to resources, and then help people understand how to be safe, knowing that the winters in Saskatoon are brutal
yeah,
and that they're going to do everything to try to stay warm. So it's learning how to use fire suppressants, how ensuring people have tents that are more fire safe. So instead, again, blaming people or being weaponized is finding real solutions for people while they are unfortunately in encampments, because that
yeah.
too is a reality, and treating it, accepting it as a reality. So in this reality, how do we help people be the safest they possibly can?
Well, I'm going to wrap us up because we're right at 2 o'clock. I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, Marie-Josée. It was so good to hear your thoughts and engage in this conversation. To everybody who was able to take the time to join us, I hope it was an interesting conversation to you and the work that you do. I know we have many folks from government, from the nonprofit sector, and from many other spots. We will be doing more of these conversations, these beyond the headline conversations. So please keep an eye out for those as we announce them. The Office of the National Advocate, or Federal Advocate rather, is doing the National Review Panel on Housing Access for Women and Gender Diverse People. Unfortunately, we didn't get in a chance to talk more about that today, but I just want to give a plug for that process and getting involved in that process. I just there is a survey that will be sent out to folks to please fill out. Let us know what worked for you and what didn't, so we can continue to shape our conversations in a way that are the most effective and useful for you. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good day.
Take care, everyone.